So, in true Tottenham Hotspur fashion, Tottenham have managed to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory once again, a trait that we've seen so many times over the years. So, let's dive into Thomas Frank's first game as Tottenham lose on penalties to Paris Saint-Germain. Before we go any further, the main negative to come out of all of this, football aside, is just the disgusting abuse that Matisse Tells suffered as a result of his performance in this game. I it baffles me how people can just think that any sort of bad performance or something that doesn't go the way they think it is justification for sending racial abuse to a 19-year-old who's in a new country. He's essentially a kid, which I think people forget about. In the context of football, it seems like 19 is really sort of seen as like, I don't know if it's because they're athletes, so this sort of context, and maybe there's a bit of jealousy there, but the fact that someone can receive just so much abuse because of something they do on the football pitch, which that isn't provoking people, it is, and then just because their skin, they think that's just because of colour of their skin, people think that's ground to, you know, abuse people. I think generally abuse in general on social media is bad, but the fact that you use someone's skin as sort of, I don't know, the a weapon to use against them because they've not delivered on a football pitch, it's disgusting. We've seen it so many times, and I think the most depressing thing is that deep down, I think all of us probably, when that final whistle went after the penalties and we knew Tell had missed, I think there's probably part of us which is expecting it, which is a damning indictment on social media and I think society in general. And I just don't get it. I think social media, that its biggest strength is its biggest weakness, and the fact that anyone can communicate with anyone. And maybe that's why these people who are hidden behind bot accounts probably don't go to the games, probably never been in a sports sort of club at amateur level where, you know, if you say something stupid, you know, you can expect like a clump around the ear or to be put in your place. And it's disgusting because why? It's just not needed. And it really put a dampener on what was, for the most part, a positive evening for Spurs. So let's dive into the game. Thomas Frank lined up with a back five, which is probably what I would have expected, just in terms of the personnel available. So Spurs lined up with back five, Vicario in goal, Porro and Spence as wing backs, and then a back three of Danso, Romero and Van de Ven. Then moving into the midfield, a debut for João Palhinha, who was alongside Pap Sarr and Rodrigo Bentancur, and then Mohamed Kudus, who really played a bit more of a supporting role to Richarlison. I think going back to the last recording I did, speaking about how PSG essentially dominated Europe, and the way they did that by really having power in the wings and skill and unpredictability in the wings, and then packing that midfield, pushing teams high up the pitch and really forcing them back. And I think before the game, I don't think many people were expecting a win. Obviously, the context of that changes when you're 2-0 up on 85 minutes, but I think it went better than people thought it was going to be, and there were more positives than negatives, and I think it sort of harks back to that, you know, you can call it Spursy, and yes, it probably is, but then again, that tags only, maybe the narrative's a bit different with Tottenham, is something that Ange Postecoglou talked about last year, in terms of when Spurs do something, it's seen as Spursy, but if Chelsea do it, or Arsenal, or Fulham, or Wolves, or any of these teams, it sort of feels like it's an easy narrative to point at Tottenham. But having said that, being 85 minutes into the game with 2-0 up, to not win it then, you're not doing yourself any favours, lads. I'm going to be honest, you're not doing yourself any favours. But back to the game. Obviously, Spurs taking the lead through Mickey van der Ven just before half time. And Spurs looked really, really good. I really did think they looked good under Thomas Frank. This is probably the sort of game where you'd see the difference between the likes of Postecoglou and Frank. And, the shoe might be on the other foot of that argument on Saturday when we play Burnley, who are essentially going to want to really make it ugly. But all of the things that you'd associate with PSG and the Champions League winning run, like I said about dominating the midfield, snapping at heels, talent out wide, we really, really nullified them, and I was really, really impressed with not only the back five, but the midfield three. I thought Pape Sarr was absolutely amazing. I really, really thought he was good, and he was just snapping at the heels, and it really looked like Spurs were there. And in the first half, the longer the game was going on, the less you were getting worried about Paris Saint-Germain. And then in terms of the debutant, João Paulinho, I thought he was really, really good. And that's the sort of game which I think you're probably going to see the best out of him, where his technical ability is not really relied on. It's more about sort of industry and destroying any sort of momentum that the teams want to build, and then building on that. And then Mohamed Kudus, absolutely brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Just in terms of his ability to make the ball stick. And then Nuno Mendes was given absolute kittens by Mo Kudus all game. And you're looking at that and you're thinking, wow, what an upgrade that is on the options that we had there last year. And it's crazy to me that the Spurs hierarchy don't see these massive upgrades and think, yeah, we could do with a few more of them to pack up the squad. But we could sit and talk about Daniel Levy, Enoch, and what Spurs need to do in the transfer window till the cows come home. But that's a story for another day. But yeah, got to half-time, really, really impressed. Say it was a back five, but I think what you've seen quite a lot is in possession, Pedro Porro would push higher up and sort of either come infield and step into the midfield, or maybe push out wide and give Spurs a bit of width with Kudus and Richarlison up front. And Danso was absolutely brilliant, absolute rock at the back in that first half and throughout the second, really. And yeah, it was going into half time. You're a bit like, okay, we've had the line. Well, even though PSG had more possession, we've had the better chances, really, you'd say. And then I think at halftime we were all sort of expecting this all-conquering PSG team to come out and, sort of be let off the hook and really push Spurs back. And we didn't really see that at all in the second half until late on. Christian Romero obviously made captain the day of the Super Cup final. I say the day of. We all knew he was going to be captain as soon as Son was leaving, but his first official game as captain to mark that with a goal right in front of the away fans. And then from there, we just looked absolutely comfortable. And there's a few moments where Pape Sarr was nicking the ball high up the pitch. Richarlison was snapping at people's heels. Kudus was dragging us up the pitch. And you thought, if we get a third here, this could be 3 or 4. And that was crazy to me that we're even in that position where you thought, okay, we could kill this game off here. Obviously, the game wasn't killed off quite famously. I think it was the subs that really, really made the difference in the game. Mentioned about the wide players, Desiree Doué and Kvaratskhelia really didn't do anything whilst they were on or anything of note for me. And I think PSG actually got better when then players come off the pitch. Fabian Ruiz coming off the bench, one of the real stars of that Spain team that won the Euros last year. And then you've got Lee Kang-in, a player which has been mild links with. How believable that was with us, not this summer, but previous summers. And they change the game. they really changed the game. I think Fabio Ruiz just added a bit more of that steel in midfield, and the fact that Enrique took off Kvaratskhelia, a winger, to really pack out that midfield shows just how dominant Bentancur, Sarr, and Paulinho were. And then Lee Canton, he changed the game. Is by no means not one of the stars you'd associate with this PSG team. Of course, it's a team which has had more stars in the past in terms of Kylian Mbappe, Neymar, Lionel Messi, these types of players. But even in a less star-studded team, which seems to be the narrative around PSG, he sort of is one of the forgotten players, and he's really rescued the game for them. Fabian Ruiz did put the ball in the back of the net. He was offside by quite a while. Um, quite a distance. And yeah, as the game went on, I think ultimately there was two things that cost us that game. I think as soon as Sarr, Kudus, and Richarlison come off, that intensity and that tenacity and that sort of dogged fight in nature, we really lost that when those three went off. And I think in general the subs sort of killed the game for us. And it's one of them where we mentioned PSG, obviously not as star-studded as previous PSG teams gone by, but they really, really did have quality off the bench, and I think that's something that, because of injuries, we've not really had, and because of other factors. But yeah, obviously in the Super Cup, we've got Bergvall on the bench, and then you've got the likes of Gray and Tell coming on, 19-year-olds who, let's see, did say 19-year-olds, but in the sense that, just because they're 19, they might not have talent, which is definitely not the case. We've seen it with Lucas Bergvall last year. We've seen it in glimpses of Archie Gray last year. Not seen it so much from Tell since his arrival. And then the other sub was Dominic Solanke, who come on, and he's not really had a pre-season. I saw 45 minutes against Reading. I was at that game, and he looked a bit tired, then he looked a bit leggy. And for him to not gone to that pre-season tour to Asia, and then just to sort of be thrown in at the deep end to sort of protect the league, where a whole game plan was built on intensity, just being dogged, being hard to play against, being physical, rough, in your face, all these sorts of things that we saw for the first 70, 75 minutes. There was a bit of a drop off when the subs come on. And one of the big stories before this game was the fact that Thomas Frank decided to leave Yves Bissouma at home due to disciplinary issues around his timekeeping. Again, at some point you need to call a spade a spade. Conte had these issues with Bissouma and his professionalism in terms of I don't know what it specifically was, but I can remember that being cited at the time. We seen it at the start of last season with the laughing gas with Yves Bissouma, and that didn't miss the first game of last season as well. And then under a new management again this year to do that, and I don't think it's a conscious effort. I think it's just generally general lack of professionalism and lack of standards that he needs to set for himself. And it's a real shame, because if you go back to the Europa League, run last year, the likes of Bissouma, I think his best games for Spurs were those games against Frankfurt, Bodo Glimt, the Europa League final, and he really would have been a perfect player to replace the likes of João Paulinho with off the bench. So for him to not be available solely down to issues that are well within his control really was disappointing. But hey, that's football. So yeah, I think those subs sort of changed the game on each side. Ousmane Dembele, largely kept quiet for most of the game. I think Jed Spence's done a really good job on him, and I think it's probably one of them where mentally as well as physically it gets a bit tiring. And then against those sorts of players, a player who's up for the Ballon d'Or, and I don't think he really had a great game, Dembele, but I think the sign of a great player is you can be having a terrible game, and then the moment you give them any sort of space, they punish you. And that's exactly what they did for PSG's equaliser. Spence just a little slow in getting across, and Dembele, sort of the only real action he did all game, really punished us. And I think, again, he's up for the Ballon d'Or, and it's sort of a testament to his ability that he can not really do a lot, and then as soon as he gets, that little yard of space, he can really punish you. So that was disappointing. And then moving on to the penalties, obviously going 1-0 up after Solanke scored. I thought it was a bit of a weird selection. I said to my dad watching this that ideally you want your best penalty taker third, and the reason I've always sort of thought this is because if it's going well, then you're carrying on the momentum. If it's not going well, that third penalty sometimes can be the decisive one if things are going really badly. And I thought it was a bit of a weird selection. Penalty takers: Solanke, Van de Ven, Tell, Porro, and then we don't know who the fourth one was essentially because we didn't get to that opportunity. But yeah, overall, more positives than negatives to take from that game, I'd say. But don't get me wrong, it would have been a lot easier to shake this sort of Spursy tag that we have, and just to crush some sort of narratives going into the season for Thomas Frank, especially about him, maybe not having won a trophy in his career so far and that sort of thing. And look, I think if we won yesterday, I don't think people would be saying, "Oh, Thomas Frank, he's a winner. He's won trophies before." I don't think that would be. I don't think the Super Cup would sort of be the barometer which people talk about in terms of the trophies and that. But it's one of them that I think if we get some business over the line and we beat Burnley, it's one of them that by the time the game against Man City rolls around, people would have forgot about this Super Cup. But yeah, work we're supposed to do. It's going to be interesting to see tactically how we cope with Burnley, who I think will probably deploy a bit of a similar game plan that we did deploy against PSG, just sort of making it really ugly, defending valiantly, and then just sort of looking to break. And I think one of the things that's been cited with Thomas Frank is how tactically flexible he is. So I think Burnley on Saturday is going to be a bit of a different challenge. I can't see us operating with a back five in that game. Surely solely because the precedent's going to be set by us being the home team against a newly promoted team. Then we're going to want to assert ourselves, and it's going to be interesting to see how Thomas Frank does that, especially without the likes of James Maddison and Dejan Kulusevski, two of our real playmakers in the team, not being available. But yeah, more positives than negatives to take. Obviously disappointing, but let's move on to Saturday and see how Tottenham cope in the Premier League against what is going to be an absolutely nasty low block from Burnley. But until then, we'll just wait and see what happens, and hopefully there might be some transfers to follow that game. So if you've enjoyed this, by all means leave a comment, comment what you like. Comment Kevin Danso has a long throw if you've got this far. And yeah, I'll see you in the next one. And until then, up the Spurs.